There is a building in Basel, Switzerland, that you can find on Google Maps right now. You can see it on Street View. You can zoom in on its windows. It has no visible sign, no nameplate on the door, no indication from the outside of what goes on inside. It looks deliberately like nothing. And yet, inside that building, during the worst years of the Second World War, while cities were being bombed into rubble and millions of people were being systematically murdered, a group of bankers from both sides of the conflict sat together at the same table and continued doing business, not in secret, not in defiance of their governments, with the full knowledge of those governments, and with the explicit legal protection to do so built into the founding documents of the institution itself. The building is still there. The institution is still operating, and the men who ran it during those years were never prosecuted, never seriously investigated, and in most cases went on to distinguished careers in international finance after the war ended. This is the story of the Bank for International Settlements, and it is one of the most deliberately obscured chapters in the financial history of the 20th century. To understand what the BIS is and what it did, you first have to understand why it was created. In 1929, the Young Plan, named after Owen Young, the chairman of General Electric and one of the most connected financial figures on Wall Street, laid out a new framework for managing Germany's war reparations. The problem was logistical. Germany owed enormous sums to France and Britain. France and Britain owed enormous sums to the United States. The money had to move across borders constantly, in both directions, passed through central banks that were supposed to be sovereign institutions operating under the authority of their respective governments. It was messy and slow and politically complicated. The solution Wall Street proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Create a new institution, a bank for the central banks, a clearinghouse that sat above the political mess of individual nations, that answered to no government boss, that could move money between sovereign central banks without being subject to any of the laws or restrictions that applied to ordinary financial institutions. The Bank for International Settlements was founded in 1930. Its founding statutes, written by bankers and lawyers who understood precisely what they were doing, explicitly stated that the bank's assets could never be seized or frozen, even in times of war. The bank was self-financing. It answered to no parliament, no president, no prime minister. Its board of directors was drawn from the central banks of the founding nations, and it was headquartered in Basel, Switzerland, not because Switzerland was particularly convenient, but because Swiss neutrality provided a legal and political buffer that no other location could match. From the beginning, the BIS was designed to be a space where the machinery of international finance could continue running regardless of what happened to the countries those finances were supposed to serve. For 9 years, this arrangement was theoretical. Central banks clearing accounts and managing reparation flows did not require any special immunity from geopolitical catastrophe. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the BIS faced the question that its founders had, in some sense, always been preparing for. What do you do with an institution designed to transcend national conflict when a global conflict actually begins? The board met. The decision was unanimous. The BIS would remain open. It would maintain neutrality. It would continue operating as normal. The logic, as articulated by the bank's leadership at the time, was forward-looking. International finance would need this institution intact when the war ended. Post-war reconstruction would be impossible without it. The clearing mechanisms it managed could not simply be switched off and restarted. Shutting down would cause more harm than staying open. That was the argument. Whether the people making that argument believed it or were simply rationalizing the decision they had already made for other reasons is something that historians have debated ever since. What is not in dispute is what the decision meant in practice. It meant that in 1940, while Germany was invading France and the Netherlands and Belgium, the BIS board continued to include directors from both the Allied and Axis powers. It meant that Walter Funk, the Reich Minister of Economics and one of the architects of Nazi Germany's wartime economic policy, sat on the BIS board. It meant that Hermann Schmitz, the chief executive of IG Farben, the industrial conglomerate that would later manufacture Zyklon B, the gas used to murder people in Nazi concentration camps, also sat on the BIS board. It meant that Baron Kurt von Schroeder, whose private bank in Cologne was one of the most deeply embedded financial institutions in the Nazi power structure, was a BIS board member. All three of these men were later convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg. All three held their seats on the BIS board while the war was being fought. And the American who ran the institution during these years, who chaired the meetings at which these men sat, who signed off on the transactions that flowed through BIS accounts during the worst years of the conflict, was not a Nazi, not a fascist, not even particularly sympathetic to the German cause. He was a Yale-educated American lawyer from a distinguished New England family. His name was Thomas McKittrick. McKittrick had been appointed president of the BIS in May 1939, 3 months before Germany invaded Poland. He had no background in central banking. What he had was an extraordinary network of personal relationships spanning Wall Street, Washington, London, and Berlin. He knew people everywhere. He was trusted by everyone. And when the war began and the board made its decision to keep operating, McKittrick became the public face and operational brain of what the bank would later describe as its policy of strict neutrality. Neutrality, in this context, had a very specific meaning. It did not mean passivity. It did not mean that the bank simply held the accounts of both sides and refrained from any active role in the conflict. What it meant, functionally, was that the BIS continued to process transactions on behalf of whoever brought them, without regard to what those transactions were financing. And the transactions being brought to the BIS by the Nazi side of the ledger were not neutral in any meaningful human sense. The most documented and disturbing of these involved gold. In Nazi Germany needed gold to conduct international trade. As its military campaigns consumed the reserves of the countries it conquered, the Reichsbank developed a systematic practice of stripping those countries of their gold and moving it through institutions that could convert it into usable foreign exchange. The BIS was one of those institutions. After Germany occupied Austria in 1938, Austrian gold reserves were transferred through BIS accounts to Berlin. When Czechoslovakia was occupied in March 1939, the Czech National Bank's gold reserves, which had been moved to the BIS for safekeeping and were legally protected under international law, were transferred to the Reichsbank on Nazi orders. The BIS complied. SS officers had physically held Czech bank directors at gunpoint to extract the instructions for the transfer. The BIS, presented with those instructions, processed them. Later investigations established that the BIS received approximately 3.7 tons of gold from the Reichsbank during the war years that had been looted from Belgium and the Netherlands. Belgian and Dutch central bank gold, stripped during military occupation, laundered through the BIS, converted into the foreign exchange that kept the Nazi war machine economically functional. That gold was eventually returned to the Allied Commission in 1948. During the war, it had been used. McKittrick traveled freely through Nazi-occupied territory throughout the war. He met regularly with Reichsbank officials in Berlin. He conducted foreign exchange transactions on behalf of the Nazi government. He formally recognized, through BIS administrative procedures, the Nazi occupation of 10 European countries, including France, Belgium, Greece, and the Netherlands, by accepting the transfer of those countries' BIS shares to their Nazi occupation governments. By the war's peak, most Axis-controlled central banks held nearly 67% of the BIS's total voting stock. Emil Pohl, the Reichsbank vice president, who was personally responsible for processing the dental gold stripped from concentration camp victims, a crime for which he was later convicted at Nuremberg, referred to the BIS privately as the Reichsbank's only real foreign branch. He meant it as a compliment. McKittrick would have found that characterization uncomfortable. He was not an ideological Nazi. By multiple accounts, he found the extermination camps genuinely abhorrent. But he had made a decision early in the war and repeatedly thereafter that international finance operated on a different moral plane than the political violence surrounding it, that the health of the institution was a value that superseded the question of what the institution was being used to accomplish. He was not the only person who had made this decision. He was simply the most visible one. What made McKittrick's position uniquely strange was that he was simultaneously useful to both sides. American intelligence services were aware of his access to German officials and German economic data. They used it. McKittrick passed information about German war planning and economic conditions to contacts in Washington throughout the war. He was, in some functional sense, an intelligence asset. He was also, in an equally functional sense, the operational manager of a bank that was processing looted gold for the Nazi regime. He held both roles simultaneously. The men in Washington who received his intelligence reports knew about the BIS transactions. They chose not to raise the issue formally. The machinery of international finance and the machinery of intelligence were, in this case, being operated by the same person, and both sets of operators found the arrangement convenient enough to maintain. At the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944, where the post-war international financial architecture was being designed, the United States delegation, under the direction of Treasury economist Harry Dexter White, pushed hard for the liquidation of the BIS. White had been following the bank's wartime activities closely. The evidence of its role in processing Nazi gold was available to anyone with access to Treasury intelligence files. A resolution was passed by the full conference mandating that the BIS be liquidated as soon as possible. The vote was not close. The assembled nations of the Allied coalition had determined that this institution should not continue to exist. The liquidation never happened. The central bankers quietly killed the motion. In the months after Bretton Woods, the governors of the major central banks, operating through informal channels and without any public announcement, organized the political resistance that would prevent the resolution from being implemented. The argument they made was the same argument the BIS board had made in 1939 about staying open. The institution was too important for post-war reconstruction to sacrifice it for the principle of accountability. The argument carried. Congress passed the Bretton Woods Agreements Act in 1945. The section on BIS liquidation was not included. The bank remained open. McKittrick stepped down as BIS president in 1946. Within the same year, he was appointed vice president of Chase National Bank in New York, the Rockefeller-controlled institution that was itself one of the most significant American financial actors in the wartime accommodation to the Nazi regime. He oversaw foreign loans. The Belgian government decorated him that same year with the Royal Order of the Crown. This was the Belgian government decorating the man who had presided over the institution that processed the looted gold of the Belgian Central Bank. The ceremony went smoothly. No one in the room appeared to find this ironic. McKittrick died in 1970. His obituaries described him as a distinguished international banker who had maintained an important institution through difficult circumstances. The BIS was not mentioned in most of them. The institution McKittrick had run exists today as the primary coordinating body for the world's central banks. Its headquarters remain in Basel. The building on Google Maps is a tall cylindrical tower now, modernized in the 1970s, still without obvious external identification, still technically outside the jurisdiction of any national government. The BIS currently manages accounts for approximately 60 central banks, representing around 95% of world GDP. Its total assets under management are measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Its annual reports are publicly available. Its governance structure, however, remains what it was designed to be in 1930. It answers to no parliament. It is subject to no external audit by any national authority. Its founding immunity from asset seizure, even in wartime, remains in the founding statutes, the principle at the heart of its creation, that there should exist a space in the international financial system where money moves above the jurisdiction of any government, above the reach of any court, above the moral and legal frameworks that apply to everyone else operating in the same world. That principle was never seriously challenged. The BIS survived the war. It survived the Bretton Woods liquidation vote. It survived the Nuremberg trials, at which its wartime board members were convicted of war crimes, while the institution they had served was not mentioned in the proceedings in any serious way. It is still there. The men who ran it during those years would recognize it immediately. The story of the BIS is not a conspiracy theory. The facts in this account are drawn from post-war investigations by Allied commissions, from the records of the Nuremberg proceedings, from declassified Treasury documents, from the BIS's own archival materials, and from the work of historians including Charles Hyam, Adam Labor, and others who have spent careers reconstructing what this institution actually did between 1939 and 1945. The documents are in the National Archives of multiple countries. The gold transfers are recorded. The board minutes are preserved. The McKittrick meetings in Berlin are documented in Reichsbank records. The facts are not in dispute among serious historians. What is in dispute, and what has been in dispute ever since the war ended, is what those facts mean. Whether an institution can be both indispensable to the global financial system and morally responsible for what that system was used to accomplish during the worst atrocity in human history. Whether the people who ran it bear a different kind of accountability than soldiers and politicians, because their decisions were made in offices rather than on battlefields. Whether the principle of institutional continuity, or the idea that certain financial mechanisms must be preserved above all other considerations, constitutes a legitimate moral framework or an elaborate rationalization for choosing money over people. McKittrick and the men who sat on the BIS board with him had an answer to that question. They had constructed an internal moral architecture in which the question itself was not quite real. Finance was a neutral instrument. They were its technicians. The political violence occurring outside the building was, in some fundamental sense, someone else's problem. The gold came in, the accounts were settled, the books balanced, the institution survived. That was what mattered. The cost of keeping it running was paid by the people whose gold had been melted down, whose accounts had been stripped, and whose deaths had been, in no small part, made operationally sustainable by the foreign exchange that flowed through those accounts in Basel. That cost does not appear in the BIS annual reports. It never has. If you found this story as disturbing as I did researching it, subscribe. This channel exists to tell the parts of history that get quietly edited out of the official version. Drop in the comments which institution or dynasty you want examined next. I read all of them.